aiming to connect a region of over 600 million bridges between our lands.
Good evening, I'm Alma Angeles and you're watching ASEAN in Focus on tonight's headlines.
Gentlemen, we had an excellent summit.
During the EU-ASEAN Commemorative Summit, the EU and its member states in a Team Europe approach announced the mobilization of 10 billion euros as part of Global Gateway to accelerate infrastructure investments in ASEAN countries. At the EU-ASEAN Summit, President Marcos said the competition between the United States and China are tensions he'd rather not have in our part of the world. Almost 500,000 of other workers in Vietnam have been forced to work fewer hours as orders fall in the Southeast Asian country, one of the world's largest exporters of clothing, footwear, and furniture. And the Philippine economy's performance, especially in the third quarter, shattered the expectations of the Asian Development Bank, prompting the Manila-based Multilateral Development Bank to raise its forecast for the country's GDP growth this year. First in our news, President Marcos Jr. On Wednesday, Brussels time expressed optimism that the ties between the Association of Southeast Asian Nations and the European Union will reach greater heights. This as the president hoped to achieve more milestones amid the Philippines' role as country coordinator for ASEAN in its dialogue relations with the EU until 2024. He also cited the signing of the ASEAN-EU Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement in October and the adoption of the Plan of Action to implement the ASEAN-EU Strategic Partnership for 2023 to 27 as among the two regional blocs' achievements. Let's listen in.
We look back on ASEAN-EU achievements, most recently the signing of the ASEAN-EU Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement that was signed last October, and the adoption of the Plan of Action to implement the ASEAN-EU's Strategic Partnership for 2023 to 2027. We noted the continued strengthening of cooperation between our regions throughout the pandemic through the following mechanisms: the ASEAN Regional Integration Support from EU+, the EU support to higher education in the ASEAN region, the Enhanced Regional EU-ASEAN Dialogue Instrument, the EU-ASEAN Cooperation on Sustainable Use of Peatland and Haze Mitigation, biodiversity conservation and management of protected areas in ASEAN, the integrated program in enhancing the capacity of AHA Center and ASEAN Emergency Response Mechanism, and the ASEAN-EU Migration and Border Management Program Phase 2, to name but a few. I assure my fellow ASEAN member states and all European Union member states that the Philippines will continue to expend all efforts available to ensure that the implementation of the Plan of Action to implement the ASEAN-EU Strategic Partnership for 2023 to 2027 proceeds as intended. We will strive to expand and deepen our cooperation in the priority areas of post-pandemic economic recovery, strengthening of public health institutions, maritime security and cooperation, environmental protection and sustainable economic development, combating, of course, climate change, and connectivity, with its new definition, which goes beyond the strict definition of digital connectivity, but connectivity in all manners, by air, by land, by sea, by digital means. We also will work for the digital transition and the lessening of the so-called digital divide, migration, and gender justice. We look forward to nurturing and bringing forth ASEAN-EU relations to greater heights in our role as country coordinator for ASEAN-EU relations in the next 2 years. Before I end, allow me to thank Your Excellencies, EU Council President Charles Michel, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Czech Prime Minister Peter Fiala, and all EU member state leaders for your very warm welcome that you have given us all here in Brussels. And we look forward to the next commemoration of EU-ASEAN relationships. Thank you.
Now, during the EU-ASEAN Commemorative Summit, the EU and its member states, in a Team Europe approach, announced the mobilization of 10 billion euros as part of Global Gateway to accelerate infrastructure investments in ASEAN countries. The EU has been on a diplomatic push to galvanize a global front against Moscow, as its invasion has sent economic and political shockwaves around the world. Now, investments will focus on energy, transport, digitalization, education, and promote trade and sustainable value chains. They will also support Southeast Asia's transition to a green economy, better access to essential services, and economic opportunities and jobs. Let's listen in.
Gentlemen, we had an excellent summit today with our ASEAN partners. Quite a special summit too, indeed, because it marks 45 years of relations between us, and it's a perfect occasion just to open a new chapter in our partnership. We are what you just said and called strategic partners. We stand behind this term. What stands behind this term is the reality of two regions that have so much in common, despite being a world apart. We are the two most successful regional integration projects in the world. We share the same unyielding commitment to multilateralism and the international rule of law. That means the same rules for all, whether big or small, and we both want to relegate the notion of spheres of influence to the past, where it belongs. The European Union pleads for closer cooperation between the EU and the ASEAN partners. Russia has unleashed its war of aggression against Ukraine. War has returned to the European continent, and it is clear that this is not solely a European problem, but the world is feeling the brutal shockwaves of this war on food prices, on energy security. And all this is a stark reminder that today, in this world of interdependencies, there is no such thing as a European problem or an Asian problem either. All the challenges we face today are of global nature and therefore affect all of us. You, ASEAN, know what is at stake, and therefore we are very grateful that you have signed the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation with Ukraine. We very much welcome that. The more acute global challenges are, the stronger our partnership must be. And today, we indeed discussed several strands of work to reinforce this partnership. The first one is energy. We want together to accelerate with our partners the clean energy revolution. So today we launched a Just Energy Transition Partnership with Vietnam, for example, similar to the one we have with Indonesia. And we have also decided to start an EU-ASEAN new energy dialogue, because we all know renewable energy is not only good for our climate, but it is also homegrown and therefore creates independence and security of supply. Second point is trade. A lot has been said on trade. We want to trade more with each other. We already are each other's third largest trading partners. Our free trade agreements with Vietnam and Singapore are delivering. That's impressive. So the European Union wants to conclude more such agreements with ASEAN countries, and our ultimate goal would be to negotiate a region-to-region free trade agreement. And my third and last point is on infrastructure. Because our energy and trade cooperation will only reach its full potential if it is underpinned by the right infrastructure. Today, Team Europe put forward a 10 billion euros investment package under Global Gateway. We have behind us over 4 decades of partnership, and we will continue championing peace, stability, and prosperity together. Thank you very much.
While Europe pressed for a tougher response to Russia, another global giant figured prominently at the summit. Chinese claims over the South China Sea have set it against some neighbors and sparked fears in Europe over trade flows through the key global thoroughfare. But China remains the biggest trade partner for ASEAN, and many in the region are wary of distancing themselves from their giant neighbor. The EU is keen to pitch itself as a reliable partner for Southeast Asia's dynamic economies. Amid the growing rivalry between Beijing and Washington, the EU and ASEAN are each other's third largest trading partner, and Europe sees the region as a key source for raw materials and wants to increase access to its booming markets. Meanwhile, EU President Charles Michel welcomed the EU-ASEAN Plan of Action until 2027. He also hailed the EU-ASEAN Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement, or CATA, the first ever region-to-region aviation agreement. He also pressed on the security cooperation in several Asian and ASEAN partners, including maritime security plus the crisis in Myanmar. Myanmar was not invited to the summit. Here's more.
For relations with the European Union. Today, we are endorsing our EU-ASEAN Plan of Action until 2027. We also just concluded our EU-ASEAN Comprehensive Air Transport Agreement, the first ever region-to-region aviation agreement, and we signed our partnership and cooperation agreements with Thailand and Malaysia. These agreements will strengthen our political dialogue and boost our cooperation with the two countries. Today, the EU-ASEAN celebrated 45 years as partners, and this month also marks the 2-year anniversary of the EU and ASEAN becoming strategic partners. The EU-ASEAN partnership is unique. It brings Europe and Asia closer together to increase the security and prosperity of our citizens. The EU is ASEAN's second largest foreign investor and third largest trading partner. Together, we represent over 1 billion people in 37 countries. So, our partnership is a major force with great potential to tackle global challenges like climate change, digital transition, and free and fair trade. The Indo-Pacific is a region of growth and opportunity. And as a strategic partners, we are strong advocates for multilateralism and the international rules-based order. We share the strong belief that global challenges can only be addressed by working together. And today's meeting is also an opportunity to boost our cooperation for greater prosperity. And one way to do that is through trade. Trade is a powerful engine for growth and for creating closer ties between our regions. Our trade agreements with Vietnam and Singapore are a good example, and we are working on trade agreements with other countries in the region. We can also forge stronger ties for the good of our planet. Climate change is a threat to everyone's existence, and we share the same objective. We owe it to the next generation to cooperate on this global challenge together. We also discuss the importance of the digital transition. This will play a massive part in the success of our societies. So, we need to band together to develop safe, fair, and inclusive digital economies. We also discussed the war against Ukraine and its dramatic consequences for the world, especially on energy and food security. This war blatantly violates the United Nations Charter, and the attempt to change internationally recognized borders by force is not acceptable. We will never accept it. We also discussed the crisis in Myanmar that negatively impacts stability in the region, and we continue to support ASEAN's efforts to address this crisis. We support the full implementation of the 5-point consensus and the personal investment of Prime Minister Hun Sen. Finally, we discussed our intensified security cooperation with several Asian and ASEAN partners, including maritime security. Maritime security is vital for the world, is vital also for Europe due to the importance of trade routes and their protection. It's in our mutual interest to bolster our cooperation in this area.
At the EU-ASEAN summit, President Marcos said the competition between the U.S. and China are tensions he'd rather not have in our part of the world. Let's listen in.
If it's that what we want, believe me, we would rather not have these tensions in our part of the world. That is the last thing that we would like. And the Philippines, for our part, has taken an independent policy, and we absolutely refuse to go back to the situation of the Cold War, where we have to pick sides in terms of who the superpower is that we are aligned with. What we say is that, to put it very simply, is that in the Philippines, our foreign policy is the policy for peace and for the national interest. So foreign policy will always be guided by a commitment to peace and the pursuit of the national interest. In terms of that competition, as I said, we have to find, I think all of us, member states, especially in ASEAN, have to find our own way. However, I think I would not be overstepping by saying that we agree in the sense that we are committed to the idea that the future of the Asia-Pacific region should be decided by Asia-Pacific countries and not any other power outside of our area.
Also, at the same press conference of the ASEAN-EU Commemorative Summit, President Marcos was asked what concrete steps both regional groups could take to ensure the rule of law in disputed maritime areas. China, to recall, has invoked its historical 9-dash line, and it also claims most of the South China Sea. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague invalidated China's claims and upheld the Philippines' exclusive economic zone as provided under UNCLOS. China has repeatedly said that it did not recognize this arbitration ruling. Again, let's listen in.
Any possible actions that might be jointly taken, because every action that might be taken that objects or brings light to a possible violation of the UNCLOS is much stronger when it is brought about by a group of nations such as ASEAN, and if the EU now, with our strategic partnership, is able to also join their voices to that, then that will be much stronger in the terms of actually being able to enforce what UNCLOS is all about. Their commitment, by the EU's commitment, which is found in the joint declaration, the EU's commitment to even the doctrine of the DOC, the doctrine of behaviors in the South China Sea, is already a very, very big step for us in the Philippines, for example, and for all the countries around the South China Sea, that we now have the support, a strategic support from not only the member countries of EU, but of EU itself. Now, because EU and ASEAN together comprise the largest, most well-organized regional aggregations, then that will be a very, very strong position to be able to negotiate, even individually for the Philippines or jointly with ASEAN or even with the EU as perhaps as a third party for us to take action and to negotiate further these difficulties that we are all having to face with the problems in terms of territoriality.
In tonight's other news, the Philippine economy's performance, especially in the third quarter, shattered the expectations of the Asian Development Bank, prompting the Manila-based Multilateral Development Bank to raise its forecast for the country's GDP growth this year. The ADB said growth this year is now expected to reach 7.4% from the bank's September estimate of 6.5%. ADB Philippine Country Director Kelly Bird said this is the highest growth forecast in the region. Let's listen in.
Philippines' economic performance this year has shattered all of our forecasts for 2022. Generation Z would say slayed the forecast.
In its ADB Outlook supplement, the Manila-based Multilateral Development Bank said growth in the 3 quarters of the year was driven by robust private consumption and investment, by sustained public infrastructure spending. Mr. Bird also noted that the recovery of employment, increase in remittances, buoyant tourism, retail, trade, services, exports, and expansion of the manufacturing sector helped boost economic growth. However, this may not be sustained due to high inflation. And the ADB expects inflation to average 5.7% this year, higher than its September forecast of 5.3%. Mr. Bird said the core inflation rates have been going up, and that means inflation expectations are rising. Now, that raises a concern that inflation starts to become sticky. That is, he said, it's hard to reduce. The Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas is fully aware of that, he said, and just to let you know, he said that it's not just in the Philippines, but it's global. Nonetheless, Mr. Bird said there is light at the end of the tunnel. Many advanced economies are already seeing core inflation peak. And with the Philippine economy 2 quarters behind these countries, it's possible that inflation will peak by mid-2023. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Singapore's Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong christened 2 new types of submarines for the Republic of Singapore Navy at the ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems shipyard in Kiel, northern Germany. Take a look.
Sicherheit und Stabilität auch im Indopazifik sorgen dafür, dass die internationale Ordnung insgesamt aufrechterhalten werden kann. Sie sind ein Schutz gegen Imperialismus und Kriegstreiberei. Russlands Krieg gegen die Ukraine ist ein Frontalangriff auf diese internationale Ordnung.
The 2 new submarines, Impeccable and Illustrious, were launched in freezing conditions about 12 p.m. German time.
Ladies and gentlemen,
at the
please rise.
ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems shipyard in Kiel by Mr. Lee's wife, Madame Ho Ching, who activated a mechanism that broke 2 champagne bottles onto the hulls of both submarines simultaneously. Now, Mr. Lee noted in his speech that it's quite unusual that the 2 submarines were launched in the water, as naval vessels are traditionally launched out of water at an earlier phase of construction. In a separate statement, on Tuesday, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that Mr. Lee and Mr. Scholz reaffirmed both countries' long-standing and excellent bilateral ties, in particular in defense and economic cooperation. Both leaders also expressed their desire to make progress in areas of common interest, such as in innovation, climate change, renewable energy, and the green economy. Meanwhile, rich nations pledged to raise at least $15.5 billion to help get Vietnam off fossil fuels and reach carbon net zero by 2050, according to a joint statement. Take a look. Vietnam is a dynamic emerging economy at the heart of Southeast Asia. The investment we are making today means the country can cut its emissions while simultaneously creating new jobs and growth. That, according to British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak in a statement. Together, he said, we will deliver a cleaner, greener future for Vietnam and our planet. Partners, including the European Union, Britain, the United States, Canada, and Japan, struck an agreement with Vietnam to accelerate the peaking of its greenhouse gas emissions and transition away from fossil fuels to clean energy. It looks to bring forward Vietnam's peak greenhouse emissions to 2030, cut coal capacity, and accelerate its adoption of renewable energy, so it accounts for at least 47% of power generation by the end of the decade. Vietnam relies on cheap and abundant coal supplies for its energy as it seeks to power its fast-growing economy. The initiative is the third of its kind aimed at getting richer countries to assist developing nations to go green after deals with Indonesia and South Africa. Pantene has spent a decade assembling shoes for worldwide brands such as Timberland and K-Swiss. But she's now among tens of thousands of Vietnamese factory workers laid off as Western consumers cut spending. Almost 500,000 other workers in Vietnam have been forced to work fewer hours as orders fall in the Southeast Asian country, one of the world's largest exporters of clothing, footwear, and furniture. Take a look.
Khổ ha, tại Covid cũng có nhiều mạnh thường quân giúp đỡ, còn bây giờ công ty Tỷ Hùng nó thất nghiệp đâu có ai giúp đỡ đâu, tại vì giờ đâu còn bị Covid nữa đâu mà giúp đỡ, vậy đó, mình tự lực cánh sinh.
Trước đó công ty cũng đã họp với thông báo với mọi người cho mọi người biết là do công ty tình hình không có đơn hàng nên công ty cắt hợp đồng, thì nói chung mong công nhân cũng thông cảm cho công ty. Công ty nó cũng có thông báo trước, mà trong cắt thì mình cũng công ty nó cũng chỉ trả lương thôi chứ cũng chẳng cho công nhân một cái chế độ, một thân lương hay là cái gì hết.
Này nó khác, khó khăn Covid là có đơn hàng, cái chuỗi cung ứng có nhưng mà bị gãy và không có người làm và không được phép làm trong cái điều kiện không bảo đảm. Còn đây là có đầy đủ nhưng mà lại không có đầu ra.
In a small corner of a once grand old villa in the heart of Hanoi, Nguyen Man Tri surveys the home he has loved since childhood, but is now giving up as its foundations crack, roof crumbles, and staircase buckles. Most of the old villas in Hanoi are close to a century old, built during French colonial rule, and have been degraded by age and humidity. Despite their protected status, the future of these homes and their residents hang in the balance. Take a look.
When I was a kid, I remember this house. It was a beautiful house located in the center of the lot. A lot of very shiny, a lot of tree, and this house is, for me, it's like a castle. You see the structure is deformed. You see a lot of crack in the wall. Yeah, actually, because here is the wall is loading, so there is a crack. And when the neighborhood, they built a big building here, so the house is deformed, the transformed, and even the foundation is cracked.
Thế còn những cái công trình mà kiến trúc mà được xây sau đầu thế kỷ 20 ấy, thì nó cũng có nhiều chất lượng khác nhau. Và nếu nó được sống đến bây giờ, tồn tại đến bây giờ, thì cũng phải liên tục sửa chữa, cải tạo, nâng cấp. Chừng cái chu kỳ nó độ 20 năm đến 30 năm một lần, chứ không thể lâu hơn được. nó phải được sơn quét vôi lại, chát vá, bởi vì ẩm mốc rồi thì long lở, thì cửa giả phải thay đổi, cầu thang, rồi nền lát cũng bị cong vênh.
If we cannot keep this house, but yeah, somehow it's difficult. It's quite, we cannot get out of this situation.
The listed villas, now often hidden behind cafes, noodle shops, and fashion boutiques, were built both by the French and by Vietnamese architects for their wealthy compatriots working under the colonial power. When the French left in 1954, thousands of these homes were taken over by the communist government and turned into offices, while authorities required any owner still in Vietnam to divide up their property and give portions to poor Vietnamese. In 2015, 2 people died when a villa built in 1905 and home to around 20 people fell to pieces. Authorities first drew up regulations to protect the villas in 2013, but have gone back and forth over the path forward for the homes. Now, Hanoi says it aims to renovate 60 by 2025, but faces long, drawn-out negotiations to convince each and every resident to move. The government and residents hope to return the heritage homes to their former glory. As my usual habit, I'd like to end the day on a positive note. Let's encourage and build each other up so that no one is left behind. And that's it for tonight's broadcast of ASEAN in Focus. I'm Alma Angeles, reminding you to stay in the news because we live in extraordinary times.